Our attention to our presenter.
I read The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, How White People Profit from Identity Politics by George Lipsitz. George Lipsitz is an American Studies scholar and professor in the Department of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and has written several books. His academic focuses include the study of social movements, urban culture, inequality, the politics of popular culture, and whiteness studies. The Possessive Investment in Whiteness was originally published in 1998, and I read the revised and edited edition, which was published in 2006. In the book, you can even see in the title, Lipsitz argues that whites have a possessive investment in whiteness. He writes, I use the adjective possessive to stress the relationship between whiteness and asset accumulation in our society, to connect attitudes and interests, to demonstrate that white supremacy is usually less a matter of direct referential and snarling contempt, and more a system for protecting the privileges of whites by denying communities of color opportunities for assets accumulations and upward mobility. A little bit further down, he writes, while one can possess one's investments, one can also be possessed by them. I contend that the artificial construction of whiteness almost always comes to possess white people unless they develop anti-racist ideas, unless they disinvest and divest themselves of their investment in white supremacy. I actually didn't know the difference between divest and disinvest, so I had to look it up. Disinvest is to withdraw or reduce an investment, and divest is to deprive someone, so in this example, I think it would be a white person depriving themselves of power, rights, or possessions. The dictionary had an example, men are unlikely to be divested of power without a struggle, and of course the same is probably true for white people. I also appreciated he drew on Michael, I think, Omi's distinction between referential racism, so the types of racism that we've talked about a lot that white supremacists do, and inferential racism, which is a system of structured inequality that allows white people to remain, he writes, self-satisfied and smug about their own innocence. People are able to disown racists while at the same time assuming that their homes, their education, and jobs came to them because of individual merit and are not the result of collective efforts. The possessions of whiteness are protected and maintained by white people as a group and also frequently by the government. The book explores whiteness as an identity and a group identity. The possessive investment identifies the ways that whiteness is normalized and made invisible. This maps the strategies that whites use as a group to maintain privilege and power. This book identifies the way in which power, property, and the politics of race in our society continue to contain unacknowledged and unacceptable alliances to white supremacy. So a brief summary of the book, the first two chapters and chapter 5 outline the ways that white privilege is created and maintained and some of the consequences of this. The second chapter powerfully illustrates the way that what he calls white resistance, refusal, and renegotiation undermined the 1964 and 1965 Civil Rights Act. He really goes into detail about the legal and extra-legal ways that whites work to collectively deny black people access to fair and equal housing, which is a major source of assets for white people and asset accumulation, schooling, and equal employment opportunities. This denial has allowed whites to maintain the de facto advantages they held as a result of de jure segregation. Also, white resistance and refusal has led to a renegotiation of anti-discrimination law to such a degree that efforts to combat discrimination are now considered discriminatory. That last sentence was a quote. And I want to emphasize that because that was one of the points of his book that he draws out. He writes that white efforts to portray victims of racism as the beneficiaries of unearned privileges given to them because of their race hide the history of the possessive investment in whiteness and inverts the history of racial politics in the United States. In other words, whites portray themselves as the victims and blacks as the perpetrators. And while this is deficient as history, these public relationship campaigns have enjoyed broad successes, from attacks on affirmative action to the promotion of hate crimes against people of color. It's very effective propaganda that has helped white people rallied together to collectively defend these opportunities. Chapters 3 and 10 focus on anti-Chicano and anti-Asian policies and practices. He explores Proposition 187, which was passed in 1994 in California. This proposition denied medical treatment and education to undocumented workers and their children, targeted immigrants from Mexico, Central America, and Asia, and creating a new legal category of the suspected illegal immigrants, which could justify extensive surveillance, supervision, and of course led to the criminalization of these groups of people. Chapter 3 also discussed ethnic studies and identity politics as helpful tools for abolishing white supremacy through critical scholarship and creating more ground for coalition building between groups. And Chapter 10 connected Black liberation movements with Asian American liberation efforts in the 90s. Chapters 4, 6, and 7 examine cultural appropriation and anti-Black racism and media's role in maintaining narratives that center and confirm whiteness. One of these chapters mentioned something about lone wolf attacks, which we keep bringing up in this class. He wrote, hate crimes enact the rage of individual sociopaths, but they also look for justifications in the patterns and behaviors that permeate the rest of society in less extreme forms. I thought this was interesting because it sort of extends the responsibility. While these are extreme views, they are similar to these less extreme, broader views that are held by society at large, some people in society at large. The last chapter goes into detail about mutual aid in poor Black communities in New Orleans and the impact that Hurricane Katrina had on these communities. This was a chapter that was added in the edited version, not the original one. And the ways in which these communities had constructed a collective wealth together, and so the destruction of their community took away their assets, whereas wealthy communities that were destroyed had backup assets such as owning their home and were able to relocate to new communities without the loss of those informal supports. He also points to this mutual aid as a way of combating white supremacy. In closing his book, Lipsitz argues that we need to focus on opening up our imaginations to new possibilities. He writes that by shifting the focus from richest to brokest enables us to see possibilities where others only see problems. He says that changing the status quo in our country calls for hard work, sacrifice, and struggle, and confronting the people who actually run this country. He also says that it compels us to see the price we pay for the possessive investment in whiteness. This brings me to strengths and weaknesses. He did a really excellent job drawing attention to the systematic inequalities and the ways that white people are implicated in the maintenance of these inequalities. A lot of his kind of like what to be done about this felt a little bit lacking. He had some good outlines of problems and why there should be hope, but not a lot of focus on resistance. He also, I don't think, outlines the price that we pay for the possessive investment in whiteness very much. He opened each chapter with a quote by James Baldwin, which had me thinking about Baldwin's work a lot when I was reading this book. And I was thinking about the idea that Baldwin has of the price of the ticket, or what whites had to pay in order to become white, what's lost. I felt like you could put together the way in which the advantages of whiteness are carved out of other people's disadvantages, which ultimately leaves that group hollow, but it wasn't explicitly linked. I thought that the book was a little bit disorganized in the structure. It felt like when I was going through, I had to be like, oh, okay, this is kind of connected to these ideas from this chapter. These are connected to these ideas. It wasn't exactly chronological. It was kind of jumped around. I did think that the articulation of the possessiveness of whiteness was the biggest strength of this book. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. Is this a book for people that are just starting to think about whiteness and the role of identity politics, or is this like, I'm having a hard time.
One thing that I also forgot to say in my critique is this really read like it was written for white people, which I'm not, he never said that, and maybe I'm just saying this as a white person and I could be wrong, but when I was reading it, he would say we a lot instead of me, and I think he was trying to say, you know, I'm white too, I'm part of this as well. But no, I'm sure it would trigger. He went into a little bit about kind of like the ways that white people defend it, so the ideas of white shame and white fragility. But no, I think he said a woman came up to him after a talk and said, "You're too hard on white people," you know. And so I think anybody who picks up this book who hasn't thought about it would probably start to think that if they're a white person. Yeah.
So do you think that this book, if read by someone who hasn't thought about their whiteness or their role as a white person?
I don't think it's, sorry.
I was just going to say, if someone were to read it, do you think it would turn them away? And it's written more for people who have already begun that process?
That's a good question. I mean, it's historical. Mm-hmm. So it's not intensely like, you know, white people are so bad, and he really strives away from that. But, you know, white fragility is a thing, and people could be turned off by that.
Does he use the term white fragility in there?
He doesn't, because he quoted the article. He quoted the woman who wrote that article without saying the article's name.
Yeah, I think this was written prior to the advent of that term becoming
yeah, that's possible.
Well-known or even articulated. I think that's post even the revision, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's what I kept thinking, because 2006 is prior to a lot of stuff that's happened.
That's only come out in the last 8 or 9 years, if that. So, I want to give opportunity for the person who's joining us by computer to ask any questions.
I'm thinking about them. I don't have one exactly right now, but...
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll keep thinking. Thank you.
All right, other questions for our presenter? So one of the criticisms that whiteness scholarship has come under from other scholars is that it treats whiteness as this sort of rarefied, reified construct that moves through history over time without being historically situated. So that a historian who criticizes a writer like Lipsitz or David Roediger or Matthew Kunt, I mean any number of other authors, would say that they're just acting like whiteness is the same thing at the beginning of the 20th century as it is at the end of the 20th century, that whiteness is the same thing in the middle of the 19th century as in the middle of the 20th century. Do you think Lipsitz opens himself to that kind of criticism, treating whiteness as this ahistorical construct removed from the streams of history and just sort of floating above history? What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, the book is focused on Civil Rights Act and beyond. Mm-hmm. So I don't know about earlier. He does go into very rigorous detail of showing how that whiteness interacts with those historical events, saying here's a Fair Housing Act and the way that whites came into that act and created an unenforceable decision. So I think there was a lot of history, but I don't know, I think that's a little bit beyond the scope of my brain. I'm not sure.
Okay. Lipsitz himself has raised some of those criticisms in articles he wrote back. And
there's a follow-up book. Do you know what does he talk about in that next book? I was curious. I didn't get a chance to read the summary.
I haven't read that in its entirety yet, so I'm not able to say, but he's a very important voice in sort of theorizing whiteness, as you can tell. I mean, that's the fact that it's in a reprint edition is an indication of that.
I had heard about this book for a long time. I had been wanting to read it, and I thought it would have a little bit more about like the psychology of whiteness. It didn't really have anything about that and the way that it kind of develops and how people develop this possessive investment. He says they do, which I totally believe, but he doesn't really get into how that happened.
Good.
I have a question now.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can't tell if anyone else was about to talk, so I'm sorry if I cut anyone off.
No, we'll give you some grace. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm wondering if he offers any tangible solutions on, or just like action steps, or just any ways to take action on how to combat possessive whiteness. Or is it just like
His
tackling of it?
concrete steps are, from what I gathered, awareness and then action. So it was concretely vague.
Concretely vague. All right, there we go. Anyone else?
Should there be a new edition? When was this one made?
2006. Yeah, there's a lot that has happened since then, including I think his New Orleans chapter didn't even finish with some of the things that happened to New Orleans as it was getting redeveloped and gentrified following the hurricane. So I'm sure he has probably written about some of this stuff. And he does have a follow-up book.
Okay.
We heard your sigh there, person on the computer. All right.
I was stretching, sorry.
Okay, I think we're good.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.